Hi everybody, this is Ted. Welcome back to week three's reading discussion. So far we've used frameworks from Laborie and Durkheim to analyze the social purposes of school, and we've traced the historical debate between Plato and Aristotle over its moral purpose. But today I want to introduce you to a new lens, which is a fundamental dichotomy that sits beneath all of these debates that we've kind of discussed so far. And that is the distinction between learning and education. Now, often we use these words interchangeably, but philosophically, they kind of point to two very different things. So, learning is an internal process of constructing, understanding, and gaining experience or knowledge. It's driven by the self, and it emphasizes the individual's journey of discovery. We might say that it actually describes the ways in which we gain knowledge. Functionally, that means it's a process term, which is basically describes a particular process or an activity, but it doesn't necessarily do anything to describe the kind of content of the process or the activity. Education, in contrast, implies a relationship. The word itself comes from the Latin educare, which means to lead out. Of course, to be led, you need a guide. And so education inherently involves an external source, and that can be a society, a tradition, religion, or a curriculum. And all of these things are trying to shape an individual and transmit some kind of idea or expectation. This tension between the individual's construction of knowledge and society's transmission of pre-existing knowledge is another one of the themes we're going to continue to wrestle with through this semester. And as we'll see today, our three thinkers, Rousseau, Wollstonecraft, and Dewey, are each going to take a distinct stance on the spectrum, setting the stage for education to be one of America's enduring sites of social, cultural, and political struggle. So, first off, we'll look at Rousseau. Rousseau is perhaps the quintessential philosopher of the Enlightenment. He's a central figure of classical liberalism, which is the philosophy that sort of helped motivate the American Revolution and the founding of the United States. And Rousseau's sort of academic, philosophical, political, educational project is a radical argument for the individual's innate capacity to learn. And it's deeply suspicious of society's desire to educate. For Rousseau, society's education is a corrupting force. It imposes artificial expectations, prejudices on people, and inequality. And it doesn't really lead students out to moral or civic virtue, but instead sort of replicates social corruption and all the sort of bad parts of society. So his solution in Emile is to isolate the child, this imaginary child Emile, from society's wickedness. The tutor's role is not necessarily to educate in a traditional sense, or transmit the culture of a corrupted world, but instead they're supposed to sort of be a manipulator behind the scenes and facilitate the learning of this child in their exposure to the natural world. Emile is supposed to learn exclusively through direct, constructed experiences, So, for example, if he breaks a window, he's supposed to get a cold. That way he learns, don't break a window. You might be familiar with this strategy if you've heard of natural consequences parenting or something to that effect. In any case, basically the lesson is learn from the inevitable consequences of nature and not sort of moralizing from a teacher or other sort of guide. So Rousseau is what he's trying to do here is sever the relationship that's inherent in the process of education. The external source is not supposed to be society or a teacher, but instead the neutral, impartial, natural world. The goal is supposed to be a pure, unadulterated learning which helps Emile develop autonomous reason and conscience as he is coming to terms with these things on his own. You might have heard of kind of similar idealistic things when we talk about people in the state of nature. Like, what would it be like for somebody to exist purely out on their own? What would that look like, and how would they develop differently than we do in a society? You can think of like maybe Tarzan as sort of an idea of that, of course. But let's see. Essentially, the archetype of Emile's education is supposed to be a child-centered approach, prioritizing the individual's process of learning above everything else. Now, if you're a sharp-eyed critic, you might point out tension, because Rousseau's education for Emile is supposed to end with him going back into society. He can't live out in the jungle like Tarzan or anything like that. So the question is, doesn't that sort of sound like Plato's Philosopher King, or the allegory of the cave, where the individual is supposed to go out of the darkness into the light and experience truth and then come back to the cave and share what they've learned with society? And wouldn't that make that sort of like a public good? So I think that is one of the interesting nuances here. But the situation is similar, where there's sort of a withdrawal from society, and then there's going to be a return, but the purpose is opposite. For Plato, the return is supposed to be an act of duty for the good of the state. The individual is supposed to be educated to fulfill sort of like a preordained role, which is, a pure public good. But for Rousseau, the return is supposed to basically be like a test of the individual's private autonomy. Will they be corrupted if we put them back into nature, or if we put them back into society after they've sort of like become a full-fledged person? We want to see if Emile can interact with society without letting it sort of change who he has become as a character. And the goal is to preserve that sort of inner Emile that has developed, rather than having it serve any sort of purpose in society or community. And this, I think, aligns with sort of the ideas of social mobility, where the purpose of education is supposed to be about individual advancement and preservation, which would make it sort of a private good. So while Rousseau's method has a Platonic shape, it's very individualistic. He uses a Platonic structure to argue for an anti-Platonic conclusion. So next we're going to move over to Mary Wollstonecraft. So I think it's important to point out that Rousseau's radical focus on individual learning was sort of a revolutionary take, but obviously there were some disagreements. And once again, this is kind of the nature of ideas. So Mary Wollstonecraft agreed with Rousseau on the importance of reason and experience over rote memorization, but she identified a fatal flaw in his reasoning, which is that his model of learning was only designed for half the population, obviously. Shocker. Because he was arguing that women should be educated for a life of pleasing men. And that way, Rousseau revealed that he wasn't really against education transmitting society's expectations, and he was in fact very in favor of reproducing a deeply oppressive patriarchal culture. So Wollstonecraft's Vindication, which is the book where our reading's from, was a call for a new kind of education. She argued for a deliberate national system of schools, a clear external source designed to transmit the values of reason and equality. For her, the relationship between student-teacher and the broader social curriculum that they would be learning was essential, not to imprison, but to liberate. The right kind of education could dismantle prejudice and create enlightened citizens, is what she believed. And she wanted to use the social relationship of education to overcome inequalities that a purely individualistic model of learning was going to be blind to. Then, a century later, we can look at John Dewey, who sort of performed a synthesis between these two perspectives. While Rousseau wanted to kind of keep the child away from society's corrupting influence, Wollstonecraft wanted to use education and the child to help improve and reform society. Essentially, Dewey agrees with Rousseau that learning must be an active and experiential part of education. He says we learn by doing. The child's individual construction of knowledge is essential to their understanding. All Rousseau, Wollstonecraft, and Dewey were all very critical of the traditional process of education. I think that's important to remember, because they agreed on this point. They're all very critical of just sort of memorizing facts without sort of anything going on up here. If you could remember 2 + 2 = 4, you didn't actually have to understand why. There was sort of just an assumption that memorizing stuff would eventually get you to where you needed to be. So in Dewey's conception, basically he agrees with learning being very important for a child's understanding, but he also thinks that the process has to be a social one. So what that means for Dewey is the school can't really be like an isolated garden, for individual learning that Rousseau might want for Emile. Instead, it needs to function sort of as a miniature community, or sort of like an embryonic society. If you think of it that way, just Dewey's arguing that basically the schools kind of serve as the, you know, the mother sort of the next generation, and helps them learn to function and grow as they become fully fledged adults and citizens. And in this model, the external source isn't going to necessarily be a distant or corrupt society or a single tutor kind of facilitating learning over, the years. It's supposed to be a community of learners. The teacher's role in this system is to structure experiences like building, cooking, or experimenting. And within these experiences, individual learning happens precisely through those social relationships that get formed in education. So you learn physics by building a loom with your peers, or you learn about civics and social expectations by working with your peers on a classroom project. So basically, there's supposed to be some self-directed learning, but it's in groups of people. Dewey believes that the individual's construction of knowledge, or learning process, and the community's transmission of culture, which are education, are not necessarily opposites, but they can be instead two sides of the same democratic coin. The relationship between the two is essential to actually make learning meaningful. So, what does this dichotomy reveal? I think that Rousseau is championing learning, which is supposed to be an individual internal process. Wollstonecraft is championing education as a social relationship that can uplift individuals and challenge or reform society. Dewey is trying to synthesize these two arguments, saying that learning should happen through education in a democratic community. I think we can actually use this dichotomy to sort of map onto our other frameworks, like the Laborie one. So, for example, I think Rousseau's push for learning aligns with Laborie's social mobility, because it's about individual development as for the individual or a private good. And the push for education aligns with democratic equality and social efficiency. The use of schooling to create, a certain kind of citizen or a worker in the case of social efficiency. And it's it's the sort of mechanism that Durkheim is talking about in his moral socialization piece. So how do we get people to become moral citizens? Well, we have to know what morality is, and we have to teach them. Finally, I think we can even see this ancient debate between Plato and Aristotle in these readings as well. As I said, sort of Rousseau, in his desire for a sort of rational, isolated education, has a sort of Platonic impulse for this ideal system, even though his goal is supposed to be about individual autonomy rather than a philosopher king returning to make society better. Wollstonecraft and Dewey, however, are very Aristotelian, which means, like Aristotle, they believe the purpose of education is supposed to be human flourishing within the individual and for the community. Wollstonecraft argues for it on the grounds of reason and justice, and Dewey is arguing for it on the grounds of democracy and experience. This shows us basically that all this stuff that we're talking about this semester, these are not necessarily new fights as we move into American culture. The tension between the individual and the community, between self-discovery and social responsibility, is sort of one of these enduring parts of educational philosophy and what people think education is supposed to mean or be for. And the American school system is going to be built directly on the bedrock of these sorts of ancient tensions. So we'll be seeing some of that soon. So if with that being said, would the founding fathers prioritize a system designed for individual learning, or would they rather build a system of public education designed to transmit the values of the new republic for unified identity? I think we've sort of seen a little bit of both. And as we learned in the Graham reading, the early American school on occasion certainly served the function of assimilation for people who are non-citizens or part of the new country. So helping the United States helped the United States to create and recreate an identity based on certain norms and expectations. And next week we're going to look at both sort of the ideal situation as presented by Thomas Jefferson in his own words and an article, and then a news article that sort of talks about the unfortunate consequences of its application when applied to Native American kids. So thanks for listening, everybody. If you've got any questions, feel free to message me or leave them in the comments here or in our class. Thanks. Bye.